Hello, Zyy'nai of planet Earth. My name is Zyy'nai, and in this episode we're going to be talking about human design for the Zyy'nai. Now, when we last left off, we talked about thinking of yourself as a character in an RPG, as a kind of a visualization technique to help you understand yourself. There are a lot of different kinds of visualization techniques that you can use to help you understand yourself, all of them very beneficial in different ways. You can think of yourself as superheroes, you can think of yourself as magical creatures, characters in an RPG, but you could also think of yourself as being like a ship or a bioship. And this kind of visualization technique in particular is very useful, especially when we start getting into the very technical heavy aspects of understanding yourself. So with tech heavy stuff, the bioship metaphor seems to work very well, but you can use whatever metaphors or visualization techniques you like, use them interchangeably. Either is fine. Any is fine. Anything that can help you see the magic behind your design is going to be very useful. One of the most important concepts to get into when we start talking about your human design is the concept of momentum and modulation. Momentum, in short, is the gaining of energy. Modulation is the curbing of energy. All mojos have 4 powers. The top 2 of those powers are called momentum powers, meaning when those powers are used, there will be a gaining of energy. The bottom 2 powers, the lower 2 ranked ones, these are the modulation powers. When these powers are used, they will curb your energy. Momentum and modulation is either going to be adaptive or directive. And this is why the adaptive and directive energy field is the primary binary flow for the psyche. The left side of the psyche is directive, the right side of the psyche is adaptive. Now, what makes one directive versus adaptive depends on what side of the psyche their momentum powers are and what side of the psyche their modulation powers are. For a directive mojo, then the left side of their psyche is momentum and the right side is modulation. For an adaptive, then the right side is momentum and the left side is modulation. As a Zyy'nai, you are directive because your momentum powers are on your left. You have directive momentum and adaptive modulation. Now there's also a front and back of the psyche. The front side of the psyche, this is where the objective powers are. And in the back, we have the subjective powers. All mojos, because of their pod power hierarchy, are going to be weighted either in the front, making them objective mojos, or they'll be weighted in the back, making them subjective mojos. As a Zyy'nai, you have Z as your source power. Z is an objective power. This means you are actually weighted in the front, making you an objective mojo. In the psyche, there is also corridors. In the front left to the rear right, then we have the discernment corridor. Discernment is making decisions based on certain criteria. There is also the perception corridor, which goes from the front right to the rear left. The perception is the taking in of information. Now, mojos are actually weighted with either perception or discernment over the other, depending on their pod power hierarchy. As a Zyy'nai, you are a discernment lead mojo, and this is because Z is a discernment. It is a decision-making power, and it's a source power. So this means you are actually weighted with discernment on top. You lead with discernment. Both of the corridors then actually split up into 2 channels. In the discernment corridor, there is the logic-based channel and the values-based channel. Now, these are all discernment, so all these have to do with making decisions. Logic-based discernment is decisions based on logical or sequential hierarchical criteria. And values-based discernment is decision-making based on humanistic or emotive criteria. As a Zyy'nai, you are a logic-based mojo, and this is because your source power, Z, is a logic-based discernment. In the perception corridor, there is the interpretive or literal perception channels. Interpretive perception is perception that is based on patterns, and literal perception is perception that is based on details. As a Zyy'nai, you are an interpretive mojo, and this is because your interpretive perception power is ranked higher than your literal perception power. You have an interpretive perception above your literal perception, and this makes you an interpretive mojo. Because of the fact that you have Z and Nai as your top 2 powers, this gives you certain constant energy fields, and those energy fields are directive, objective, discernment lead, logic-based, and interpretive. Now let's get into the theory of why the pod powers are grouped the way they are. We talked about pod powers, but there's a certain theory to why they actually have to be structured the way they are in order to create a set number of mojos. There's something called the four considerations, and what the four considerations are, basically think of them as the baseline criteria that needs to be met in order for anyone to have basic functionality. The four considerations need to be met on either side of the psyche, and they will be met on both sides. The four considerations are objectivity, meaning being able to engage the outer world, subjectivity, meaning being able to engage the inner world, discernment, making decisions based on certain criteria, and perception, being able to take in information. Each power can address two of the considerations, and so these two powers actually need to be compounded, grouped together in such a way where this compound will address all four of the considerations. As a Zyy'nai, your Z addresses the considerations of objectivity and discernment, and your Nai addresses the considerations of subjectivity and perception. Then on the modulation side of your psyche, your V addresses the considerations of objectivity and perception, and your Zhai addresses the considerations of subjectivity and discernment. Now you'll notice that I just explained the considerations in duos of powers, with one duo on the right, one duo on the left. Well, these are called compounds, and all mojos actually have two compounds on the right and left side of the psyche. They have momentum compounds and they have modulation compounds. You can think of this as when you have a compound of power, so let's take your Z and your Nai for example, that means that these two powers are intrinsically fused together. And it's actually impossible to isolate the two. You cannot just have pure Z without Nai. You actually need to have Z and Nai together. They wouldn't really exist without the two. And so this is actually the true nature of your powers. And that any thinking of them in isolation is something that can only really be done in the abstract. Your momentum compound is called your major compound, and your modulation compound is called your minor compound. So as a Zyy'nai, your major compound is Z and Nai, and your minor compound is V and Zhai. Now remember in the Pod Powers episode when we talked about the four quadrants of the psyche being like your multi-class character? Let's explore that a bit. To review, we had the fighter or pilot, we had the wizard or hunter, we had the rogue or gatherer, and we had the priest or tower. Now these characters that I'm talking about are actually the four priorities of the psyche. Similar to the considerations, all mojos must address all four priorities. This is another reason why the powers are ranked the way they are and why there's a specific number of mojos in existence. The priority on the front left quadrant of the psyche, this is the fighter or pilot that we talked about, is the dynamics mover. To put in a ship metaphor, you could think of the dynamics mover as being like the steering wheel that you have, or even kind of the rocket thrusters. It's what you actually use in your psyche to move and guide your ship. In the rear left quadrant of the psyche, we have the wizard or hunter class. This is the priority of worldview map. To put in a ship metaphor, you could think of the worldview map as basically being like your GPS system within a ship. You know, kind of a global mapping system where you can actually see where you are placed in the world and also map out different trajectories. Then in the front right quadrant of the psyche, you remember the rogue or gatherer class. This is the stimulus register priority. The stimulus register, this is the priority that you use. They are objective perceptions, so you're using this to take in information as it's occurring in real time. So you can think of this as being like the front windows of a ship, where you're actually watching the world outside of you, the real world, as it's going on. Then in the back right quadrant of the psyche, the priest or tower character, this is the compass bearings priority. It is the compass bearings job to bring the psyche to equilibrium. So you can think of this as being like a suspension system of a ship. The balancing system for when it gets rattled or takes hits or something that manages to keep it at equilibrium. Now let's get into which priorities your powers are addressing. So up here we have your Z, which addresses the priority of dynamics mover. So you use your Z to move dynamics in a systemic, logical, piloting sort of way. Then you have your Zyy'nai, which addresses the consideration of worldview map. So it is your Zyy'nai that gives you these interpretive perceptions and speculations and predictions. Your Zyy'nai for you kind of works as this global modeling system. Then your V addresses the priority of stimulus register. So you use your V to take in visceral experiences and actual literal five senses data in real time. Then you have your Zyy'nai, which addresses the consideration of compass bearings. So your Zyy'nai brings your psyche to equilibrium, and it does so in a warm, resonating, moral compass sort of way. Now, the priorities of the psyche cannot be ranked equally. If they were, this would basically cause a logjam in the psyche. There actually needs to be a hierarchy of the priorities. So as a Zyy'nai, with your Z, then it is your dynamics mover that is ranked first. Then with your Zyy'nai, it's your worldview map that's ranked second. With your V, it's your stimulus register that is ranked third. And with your Zyy'nai, then it is your compass bearings that's ranked fourth. Okay, now let's review some of the pod powers we went over in the last episode, but this time we're going to be filling out some of their tech specs. So let's begin. Z is directive, objective, logic-based discernment. It is the source or first ranked power for the Zyy'nai. It is the dynamics mover for the Zyy'nai, and it is major momentum for the Zyy'nai. Zyy'nai is directive, subjective, interpretive perception. It is the tandem or second ranked power. Zyy'nai addresses the worldview map priority, and Zyy'nai is minor momentum for the Zyy'nai. V is adaptive, objective, literal perception. It is the offside or third ranked power. V addresses the priority of stimulus register for the Zyy'nai, and V is your minor modulation. Zyy'nai is adaptive, subjective, values-based discernment. Zyy'nai is the polar or fourth ranked power in the psyche for the Zyy'nai. Zyy'nai addresses the priority of compass bearings for the Zyy'nai, and Zyy'nai is major modulation for the Zyy'nai. Alright, so now that you know a little bit more about yourself as being this cool, magic, alien creature in this RPG game, and also a bioship of the most cutting-edge technology that natural law has to offer. So now you can continue watching more episodes and keep learning more about yourself, and of course, know yourself, grow yourself, save the world.